Hello everyone, welcome back to Daily Kaylee, finally, for the beginning of Season 3. This year I'm doing things a little bit differently, and Season 3 is going to kick off immediately with the 13 Days of Halloween series, which we all love. This is the third annual Daily Kaylee 13 Days of Halloween segment, and I'm so excited. This is my favorite thing to do every season, and I think I have some treats for you guys this season for sure. Today's episode is day number 1 of 13 Days of Halloween, and it is about Albert Fish. Albert Fish has multiple nicknames. You may have heard of the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wysteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, or the Boogeyman. All of these names are related to Albert Fish. Albert was actually not born Albert. He was born as Hamilton, and it is rumored that he decided to go by Albert in honor of a dead sibling. He was born May 19th, 1870 to two parents in Washington, D.C., and his home life is a little strange. We don't have a lot of information about his early life, but his father was over 40 years older than his mother. He was American, originally from England, and his mother was a Scotch-Irish American. So they had similar European backgrounds, but I still just find it strange that he was so much older than his mother. And his father was actually 75 years old by the time Albert was born. He was the youngest child, and he had 3 siblings that were still living: Walter, Annie, and Edwin. His family has a rich history of mental illness. I want to preface this episode by saying he is extremely mentally ill. His family has been mentally ill. It's astonishing. Obviously, you'll hear more about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to go ahead and get that out of the way. He had siblings, aunts, uncles, his mother. They were all diagnosed with mental illnesses. It wasn't just suspected. His mother actually had visual hallucinations, which is going to be important in a little bit. His father, because of old age, probably, eventually had a heart attack and he died. After his father died, Albert's mother put him into St. John's Orphanage in Washington. And at this orphanage, he was very frequently physically abused by other boys at the orphanage, by the staff at the orphanage. And later he says that he began to enjoy the physical pain that he got from being beaten at this orphanage. A few years later, at age 12, his mother got a government job, so she was going to be more stable, have some income, and she was able to remove Albert from the orphanage and bring him home. At the age of 12, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy. This boy introduced Albert to drinking urine and eating feces, which is kind of where the weird shit starts happening. After this, Albert began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress, and he would spend almost his entire weekend visiting different bathhouses. At the age of 20, in 1890, he moved to New York City. This is when his questionable activities start to ramp up. In New York City, he began engaging with male prostitutes, and he also began molesting and raping boys, and a lot of these boys were underage. Many of them were even younger than 6 years old. In 1898, when Albert was 28, his mother arranged a marriage for him with a woman by the name of Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 19 years old. They had 6 children together, and within a few years of their marriage and the birth of their children in 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny. He was convicted, and he was incarcerated for a short while. Obviously not long enough, because we haven't even gotten into, like, the juicy, terrifying details yet. But later in life, Albert told a story. Obviously, it hasn't been proven to be true, but it explains where things started to go wrong for Albert. He told this story that one of his male lovers took him to a wax museum. And he became fascinated by this piece. And it was a section of a human penis. It was not a complete penis. But when he saw this, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Around 1910, he had been released from jail. He had done his time. He was working in Delaware, and he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. He took Thomas to where he was staying, and they began an interesting relationship. It is unclear whether or not Albert forced Thomas to do these things, or if it was consensual. However, when he confessed to these crimes, it became aware that Thomas was intellectually disabled. So, even if he consented, it's hard to figure out if he understood what he was consenting to. After 10 days of their relationship, Albert took Thomas to an old farmhouse where he tortured him for 2 weeks. Eventually, Albert tied Thomas up and he cut off half of his penis. When he confessed to this crime, he said that he will never forget the scream that Thomas had or the look that he gave him. According to Albert, his intentions were to kill Thomas, cut up his body, and take it home so that he wouldn't be caught. But he feared that the hot summer weather would draw attention to the body before he could get home. So instead, Thomas poured peroxide over his wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left Thomas $10, and kissed him goodbye. He said that he took the first train that he saw to get home, and he never heard what happened to Thomas, and he never looked into it. He never tried to find out what had happened to him. In January of 1917, Albert's wife left him for a man by the name of John Strobe. He was a handyman who had been staying with the Fish family. When she left, she did not take the children, so it was up to Albert to raise the children as a single dad. According to Albert, his wife took pretty much every possession that the family owned, besides the house they were staying in. After his wife left, and he was raising these children alone, he began to have auditory hallucinations, which, like I said earlier, his mother had visual hallucinations. So it could be hereditary, it could be a factor of his environment, but this affected him in dangerous ways. Around this time, Albert began self-harming, and his form of self-harm was embedding needles into his groin and his abdomen. After his arrest, he was x-rayed, and the x-rays showed that he had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvis. He would also repeatedly hit himself with a studded paddle that was full of nails, and he would put a piece of wool that was doused with lighter fluid into his anus, and he set it on fire. He did these numerous times. It's never really been... What's the word I'm looking for? It hasn't been proven, but it was never suspected. That's what I'm looking for. He was never suspected of harming his children or abusing them in any way. But apparently he would encourage his children and their friends to paddle him with the nail-studded paddle that he would use on himself. So you can only imagine how this would affect the children mentally, regardless of how he treated them physically. A few years later, around 1919, Albert met another intellectually disabled person in Georgetown, and he stabbed this man. Albert's victimology shows that he would choose either mentally disabled people or African American people as his victims. And his reasoning for this is that he assumed that they would not be missed when he killed them, so no one would come looking for them, no one would find out that he had any contact with these men. He also admitted to have, every so often, he would pay boys to bring other children to him. Albert would torture, mutilate, and murder young children with what he called his implements of hell. This included a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw that he would keep in his apartment. On July 11th, 1924, Albert found an 8-year-old girl by the name of Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' farm in Staten Island. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to go with him when her mother came outside and chased him away. Albert left, but he later returned to the barn, and he tried to sleep inside the barn to wait for Beatrice, but he was discovered by her father and forced to leave. 3 days later, it was apparent that Albert had left the farm but not Staten Island, because he killed Francis McDonnell, who also resided on Staten Island. According to Albert, he felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children, and he suffered from psychosis. I will go more into his more detailed about his victims in a second. I just want to give you the rundown of his backstory before I go into that. His most notorious victim is named Grace Budd, and before he abducted her, which shortly after this, he wanted to test his implements of hell on another child that he had been molesting. This child was named Cyril Quinn. Cyril and his friends were playing on a sidewalk, and Albert asked if they'd eat lunch, and they said no, so he invited them into his apartment to make them sandwiches. While he was making the sandwiches, the two boys were wrestling on his bed, and while they were wrestling, they moved the mattress around, and underneath the mattress, they saw a knife, a handsaw, and a meat cleaver. So they ran. I was not tested on them because they ran. Now, for the murder of Grace Budd, which I said is his most notorious victim. On May 25th, 1928, Albert saw an advertisement in the newspaper that said there was a young man by the name of Edward Budd, and he was 18 years old. He was looking for a job in the country. It listed his address so that any potential employers could come by and interview him. 3 days later, on May 28th, Albert visited Edward Budd in Manhattan at their address. He used the pretense that he was going to hire Edward. However, later on, he confessed to police that he had planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. This didn't happen. Albert introduced himself by the name of Frank Howard and said he was a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. He promised to hire Edward and his friend Willie, and he said that he would send for them in a few days to come join him. He failed to show up, but he sent a telegram to apologize and said that he would return at a later date, that he had been held up with something. When when Albert returned to meet Edward, he met Edward's younger sister, Grace Budd, who was 10 years old. He came to the Budd family with the intention of killing Edward, but then he meets Grace, and he shifts his attention to her. He makes up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party that evening, and he convinced her parents to let Grace come with him to make friends. They trusted him, and they agreed. They let her go. Albert took Grace to an abandoned house, and this house was by the name of Wysteria Cottage. He had picked this house out specifically for the murder of his next victim, whoever that may be. This house is located at 359 Mountain Road in the East Irvington neighborhood of Irvington, New York. At this house, he murdered and ate Grace Budd. The police arrested another man for the disappearance of Grace. He was accused by his ex-wife, and he was innocent, but he spent over 100 days in jail until he was found not guilty. So all of this time could have been spent finding Albert, and it was wasted. In November of 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to Grace's parents. This letter led the police to Albert. Mrs. Budd was illiterate, so she had her son Edward read it to her. This is exactly what the letter said. It has not been altered. This is what it said. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he had acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day, he spanked them. If you just heard my cat fall out of the windowsill, it is because he is too fat to be sitting there, but he's obsessed with it. So back to the letter. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wild flowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. The police investigated this letter. They could not determine if the story about Hong Kong and the children or Captain Davis, if any of it was true. However, the part of the letter that talked about Grace was extremely accurate in its description, and that this is how they knew it was Albert Fish. They never found her body, and it was impossible to confirm whether or not Albert had actually eaten Grace. He was found by the police because the letter that he had written on, it was delivered in an envelope that had a small emblem in the corner with the letters NYPCBA, which stands for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at the company told the police that he had taken some of the stationery home, but he had left it at a house that he was renting before he moved out, so it was still there. The address was 200 East 52nd Street. When they arrived at this address, the landlady said that Albert had checked out of that room a few days earlier and that he was the last one that had stayed there. She said that Albert's son occasionally sent him money, and he asked her to hold his next check for him. So, aka, he'll be back. William King, who was the chief investigator, waited outside the room until Albert returned. He approached Albert, and he agreed to go to headquarters to be questioned. However, he brandished a razor blade to get out of the situation and was unsuccessful. King disarmed Albert and took him to the police headquarters. He made absolutely no attempt to deny the murder of Grace. He even admitted that he had meant to go to the house to kill her brother Edward before he met her. Albert said it had never even entered his head to rape her. But he did confirm to his attorney that while he was kneeling on Grace's chest, strangling her, he ejaculated twice, involuntary, according to him. This information was used against Albert, and they made the claim that this kidnapping was sexually motivated. They did not want to talk about cannibalism. It was obviously a very taboo topic. So they made it a sexually motivated crime. After his arrest, more crimes were discovered. July 14th, 1924, 9-year-old Francis McDonald was reported missing. He was supposed to return home after playing catch with his friends in Staten Island, and he did not. A search party was formed, and they searched for him. His body was found hanging by a tree in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted, and then he was strangled with his suspenders. According to the autopsy report, Francis had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had almost been entirely stripped of flesh. Albert refused to claim responsibility. However, he later stated that he intended to castrate the boy, but he ran when he heard someone approaching the area. Francis's friends told the police that he was taken by an older man with a gray mustache. A neighbor of the McDonalds also told police that he observed Francis with a similar-looking man walking along a grassy path into the woods. Francis's mother said she saw the same man earlier that day. She said, "He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray." This is why Albert Fish is sometimes known as the Gray Man. This murder had remained unsolved until the murder of Grace Budd, when all of this information came out. Multiple eyewitnesses came forward to say that they saw him, including Hans Keel, the father of Beatrice, and they positively identified Albert. So then it was their intention to charge him for murder. It was only after he was charged with his next crime that he admitted that he had raped and murdered Francis McDonald. His third victim, which was technically his second after Francis and before Grace. On February 11th, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in the apartment hallway in Brooklyn with 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. When the 12-year-old brother left for his apartment, both of the younger boys disappeared. Billy Beaton was found later on the roof of the apartment. When asked what happened to Billy Gaffney, Billy Beaton said the Boogeyman took him. Billy Gaffney's body was never found. Initially, another serial killer was a suspect in Billy's murder. Then, a motorman on the Brooklyn trolley, known by Joseph Meehan, saw a picture of Albert Fish in a newspaper, and he identified him as an old man that he saw February 11th, 1927. He said the old man had been trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket, which was strange because it was cold, and he was crying for his mother. The man had dragged the boy off of the trolley. He was dragging him around. He was not following willingly. Billy Beaton's initial description of the Boogeyman matched Albert Fish. Because of these two testimonies, the police were able to match the description of the child to Billy Gaffney. Detectives of the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to identify Albert Fish as being employed by a house painter. He was working for a Brooklyn real estate company during February of 1927. And apparently, on the day of Billy Gaffney's disappearance, he was working at a location only a few miles away from where the boy was abducted. Albert wrote this in a letter to his attorney. I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked up out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of mine nails, homemade, short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears and nose and slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button, then through his legs about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. Then I put in sacks weighted with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you will see all along the road going to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sake it once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face, and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I slit the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat had roasted about 1/4 hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon, so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet. Billy Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth, visited Albert when he was in Sing Sing jail. She was accompanied by Detective William King and 2 other men. She wanted to ask Albert about the death of her son, but he refused to speak to her. Albert began to cry and asked to be left alone. After about 2 hours of asking him questions through his attorney, James Dempsey, Mrs. Gaffney gave up and was unconvinced that Albert was her son's killer, even though he was. His trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11th, 1935. His defense counsel was James Dempsey, who was a former prosecutor and a mayor from New York. The trial lasted only 10 days. Albert claimed insanity and said that he heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Albert's sexual fetishes, including sadism, flagellation, I don't think I've heard of that one, exhibitionism, voyeurism, cannibalism, like you name it, pedophilia, necrophilia. His attorney, James Dempsey, noted that Albert was a psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical history was there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities. The defense had an expert witness named Frederick Wortham. He was a psychiatrist with a specialty in child development. He conducted psychiatric examinations for the New York criminal courts. During 2 days of testimony, Frederick Wortham explained that Albert's obsession with religion was insane, basically. He said that Albert believed that similarly sacrificing a boy, such as Abraham and Isaac, would be a penance for his own sins, and that even if the act itself was wrong, the angels would prevent it if God did not approve, which makes no sense. Albert attempted the sacrifice once before, but he was thwarted when a car drove past, apparently. Edward Budd was the next intended victim. However, he settled for Grace. He knew Grace was a female, obviously, but it is believed that Albert perceived her as a boy, which is why raping her did not cross his mind. He needed a little boy for his sacrifice. Wortham then talked about Albert's cannibalism, and he said that in Albert's mind, he associated cannibalism with communion. At the end of his testimony, the judge asked him, what would you consider his mental condition be based on this life? And Wortham simply answered, he is insane. Basically, this entire trial was proving how disturbed Albert really was and how mentally ill he was. I'm zoning out right now just thinking about how crazy this trial is. I'm so sorry. It's probably really awkward for you. All of the jurors believed he was insane. However, they thought that he should be executed anyway. So they found him to be sane and guilty because they thought that he deserved to be punished regardless of his mental status. He was sentenced to death by electrocution. Albert arrived at the prison in March of 1935, and he was executed less than a year later on January 16th, 1936, in the electric chair. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m., and he was pronounced dead within 3 minutes. According to the executioner, Albert's last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." My cat fell again, I'm sorry. After the execution, reporters met with his lawyer, James Dempsey, and asked if he had a final statement from Albert Fish. Apparently he did, and it was several pages long of handwritten notes that he had written just hours before he died. However, Dempsey refused to reveal the documents and said, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." While Albert only has 3 known victims, Francis McDonnell, Billy Gaffney, and Grace Budd, he is also suspected of killing Emma Richardson, age 5, Yetta Abramowitz, age 12, Robin Jane Lew, age 6, Mary Ellen O'Connor, age 16, and Benjamin Collins, age 17. While none of those have been proven, Albert also once said that he had over 100 children and that he had a child in every state. It is not known whether he means cannibalism or rape or murder, but I will leave you with this, and I hope you enjoyed this episode to kick off 13 days of Halloween. I want to give a special thanks to my friend Ethan, who submitted this case to me. It was definitely a wild read through and through. I will see you guys in a few days. Thank you for listening.